Hello, everybody. Bruce here again. As promised, this one's going to be relatively short. And notice the North Country Community College wear I'm wearing today. This is just a listing very briefly, of 10 significant African American writers from U.S. history. There are some who include African writers who have emigrated to the United States, such as Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart. Some of you may have read that at some point in your lives. Great Africanist novel. I've not included him simply because he did emigrate to the United States and taught here for a number of years. I'm not sure if he ever became a U.S. citizen or not, but his greatest novel, at least, the Things Fall Apart, is set in Africa. It's from an Africanist perspective. It's about colonialism in Africa. It would be useful to talk about, certainly as an adjunct to Heart of Darkness, which we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks. But his perspective is not that of an African American person. He hasn't had the experiences of an African American person growing up and living in our culture, growing up and living with the particularized form of American racism, and with the sort of background and life experiences that a person of African American origin would certainly have. So I've left out some people that might seem obvious to others as great voices, and I would certainly include him in a list of any of all-time great writers from the world, but I would not think of him as an African American writer as such, since again that's not his experience growing up. Excuse me. Having a cup of tea because of my voice. I don't know what's going on today. It's April Fool's Day, and it's snowing outdoors in the first day of April after having been 60 degrees yesterday, so who knows what's going on. I will take occasional sips of hot tea to make my voice better. The first writer, and I did these in chronological order, and I'm also going to post a document to Blackboard including all of these writers and the works that I mentioned, plus another dozen or so African American voices that you should listen to and read somewhere along the line in your life. There are hundreds of others. Any listing is a listing of your own greatest hits, or your own greatest, your own favorites, or those that you consider to be the most important. I'm not an expert in this particular area of study, so I'm an expert if I'm an expert in anything in writing, and I'm an expert in American literature taken very, very broadly, and a few other things in this world, but I would not call myself an African American expert, in terms of writing. I've read somewhat more broadly than I would think the average American, but certainly not broadly enough to be able to call myself, at any comfortable level, an expert in any of this. But I have chosen 10 notable writers for a variety of reasons, and I'll try to flesh that out as I go along. The first is Phillis Wheatley. Her first name is spelled Phillis. It's sort of an unusual spelling of the name Phyllis. And her last name is Wheatley, as in Wheatley. She was born, estimated 1753, and died, that date is known, 1784. She was born, and then very early in her life transported into slavery in, of all places, Boston, Massachusetts. And so her birth name was changed. Her last name became Wheatley, the name of her enslavers. Many of you may not be aware that slavery was in existence in the northern part of the United States, or northern part of the colonies, Boston included, New York State included. My own family, who come from the Catskill Mountain area of downstate New York. I think of it as downstate. I'm an upstate New Yorker. If you were from Manhattan, you would think of the Catskills as upstate, but it's neither here nor there. But Sojourner Truth, who's going to be on my other list of notable African American writers, was owned by, enslaved by people who I am distantly related to, which I've always found utterly chilling to think about. But she was born and raised in New York State in an enslaved situation. So it always surprises people, I think, when they think of slavery in Boston, Massachusetts. Why is Phyllis Wheatley worth knowing about and reading? Well, she was an enslaved person who, during her time of enslavement, learned to read and write and began writing poetry. And her enslavers, the Wheatley family, found her poetry so skilled and inspiring that they encouraged her rather than discouraged her. In many places in the colonies and in the United States, of course, slaves learning to read and write was illegal, but it was not in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Boston was at that time during her youth. And her family traveled to England, and that is where she had her first book of poems published, called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, in 1773, so 3 years before the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of the American Revolution. The first African American poet is published. Think about that. Think about that. She was still enslaved at the time that her poems were published. Remarkable. She's not everybody's cup of tea. She's very standard sort of poet for that time. Lots of rhyme, lots of meter. She would not be in any way considered a groundbreaking sort of voice in poetry, but she voices from the position that almost nobody could possibly have voiced anything recorded permanently and for us all to read still today. The experiences and the views of an enslaved person in the 18th century in the colonies of the United States. It's mind-boggling that it was published. Her poetry is, as noted in her title, it is religious and moral. She takes positions that many would find uncomfortable today, that she thanks her enslavers, for example, for enslaving her. And, is she buttering up her enslavers? Is she trying to curry favor? I don't know. She was eventually emancipated by her enslaving family and married, had 3 unsuccessful pregnancies, and died at age 31, very, very young, even for that time. So who knows where her poetry might have gone. It is very religious. It is very bound up in religious morality of the time. So it's not everybody's cup of tea for sure, but she is a very noteworthy person. The next person on my list, again, I've arranged these chronologically, for no other reason than that just made sense to me, is a person that most of you undoubtedly have heard of, Frederick Douglass, who was, is renowned for his abolitionist work. When he escaped from slavery in his 20s and moved to the North, he settled ultimately in Rochester, New York, a city I know and love very well, having lived there for a number of years, and worked as an abolitionist. Part of that work, and he was encouraged to do this by a publisher, was to write the story of his enslavement and his escape from slavery. And this became what was a bestseller in the 19th century, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which was published in 1845, and it became a mainstay in the abolitionist movement. I mention it not because of its political significance or its historical significance, but because it is one of the best reads you will ever read. He was a fantastic writer. It reads like a potboiler adventure story. He describes his life, his learning how to read and write, the treatment he got in various locations where he lived, a fist fight that he had that nearly ended in the death of him and the person he was fighting with. It's a remarkable story. He's a remarkable American. He began a newspaper in Rochester called the North Star. He toured the country making abolitionist speeches. Many people doubted that he had actually written his own narrative because they considered an African, American person incapable of writing at that level of ability. And there was doubt cast on many of the quote-unquote slave narratives. Many of them were dictated because the people that had escaped and told about their lives were either illiterate or were not great writers, and so they would dictate their story and somebody would write it down for them. But they are authentic stories. It's just a question of whether their hand actually moved across the page. Frederick Douglass's hand actually moved across the page, and it's, again, a remarkable document. I've read it half a dozen times or more. I've taught it in high school. It just is really a great read, if nothing else, and it's historically significant as well. There were other African American writers. I mentioned the slave narratives. There's the Sojourner Truth wrote her tale. Many slave narratives in that time period, going up through the end of the 19th century. African Americans' experience did not allow for the publication of a lot of African American voices in that time period. Post the abolitionist period and post-Civil War, things changed remarkably fast. I'm not saying there weren't any writers. Of course, there was Booker T. Washington, there was W.E.B. Du Bois, turn of the century. But you don't find a lot of really significant voices in that time frame that found their way to publication and found their ways into anthologies. This is an area of my inexpertise that I need to work on for sure. But the next significant writer that in my list of 10 is Langston Hughes, who was born in 1902 and died in 1967. You'll see that the lifespan of a lot of these writers is relatively small, relatively short. Health concerns for African Americans has always been much different health expectations than for white Americans, for reasons that don't need much explanation, I'm sure. Nutrition and education and environmental issues, and the story goes on. Hughes was born in the South, moved to the North. It's a story of many African American people. He had a terrible relationship with his father, and sought the city, desire to life. He was completely compelled by jazz. He was not a musician himself, although he has an album, 1959 album, where he essentially speaks his poetry over music. But he was absolutely enthralled with the rhythms of jazz, with improvisation, and what he did was he wrote his poetry in order in a way that reflects the improvisational structures of jazz. I've only listed one book per writer, and his is actually his first book, The Weary Blues, which came out in 1926, so roughly around the time, a couple of years after F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, around the time of Ernest Hemingway is beginning to write in Paris, actually. Hughes is living in Harlem, and he's part of the Harlem Renaissance. And The Weary Blues is a book of poetry that are essentially designed to be like jazz improvisational pieces of music. And the blues is part of jazz. It's a subset of jazz, if you will. And it's a remarkable poem, the title poem, The Weary Blues, but it's a seminal work of the African American voice coming alive at a time when African American voices were really taking off. The Harlem Renaissance, which begins in the 20s and goes through the 30s and 40s, is a time of just absolute explosion in the African American arts. And Hughes is a major driver in that group of poets and writers and visual artists and musicians and so forth that centered around Harlem. There were other areas in the United States where African American voices emerge as a powerful driving social and cultural force. Chicago being one, Kansas City, believe it or not, being one, New Orleans, of course, being one. But Harlem was probably the hotbed of this new expression of African American voices. Another voice that grows out of that, slightly younger by 6 years, in the Harlem Renaissance, is Richard Wright, my next choice. 1908 to 1960, another man who didn't live a full, long life, died at 58 years old. The novel that I chose for Wright, even though he was part of the Harlem Renaissance himself, is set in Chicago, and it's called Native Son. It was published in 1940, and it's a bit of a shocker of a novel. It's predicated on the life of a young man, 20-year-old African-American man named Bigger, Bigger Thomas, who, in a series of calamities that lead to catastrophe, ends up murdering a white girl and then trying to dispose of her body in a grotesque way. And he's caught for the crime, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. It was divided in three parts, the novel. The first part being how does he get into this mess? The second part is how does he try to get out of this mess? And the third part, fate. How does it all spin out for him? It hit the bookshelves, as you can imagine, with that lurid subject matter of a black man killing a white girl, with more than a big splash. And Wright knew what he was up to by doing that. It called into question all sorts of things. Again, don't read a book just because it makes a big splash. Read a book because of its qualities and its storytelling ability, and Wright has that. His other big novel or big book is called Black Boy. It's an autobiographical story, but he wrote profusely. He was a widely read novelist of his time. The next on my list is somebody that I've mentioned several times already, and someone that is actually intimately involved in your piece of writing. And I won't say too much more than I've already said about Ralph Ellison, 1914 to 1994, author of Invisible Man, 1952. I would consider to be up there with Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn and The Great Gatsby, and a few other books, the most important books to read if you want to understand being an American, or you want to understand American literature. Invisible Man is, again, not about somebody who designs a magic potion that makes him invisible. That's H.G. Wells's 1897 great science fiction book, The Invisible Man. But this is about, again, invisibility within one's own culture. What is it not to be seen as who you are? And as an African American man, the character, unnamed throughout the novel, is experiencing that. It's just one of those books you have to read. There's nothing more to say. Ellison, interestingly, was named Ralph Waldo Ellison after Ralph Waldo Emerson. His parents had a bit of a sense of humor, I guess. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American philosopher, not so great poet, but inventor of the American form of Romanticism called Transcendentalism, a 19th century writer. But Ellison was defeated by Invisible Man in much the same way that Harper Lee was defeated by To Kill a Mockingbird. Not every novelist has the wonderful experience of having their first novel be a remarkable, groundbreaking piece of writing that everybody picks up and reads. That happened to Harper Lee with To Kill a Mockingbird. She was not able to produce another book in her entire life. After actually her death, was published a second novel that has received some attention and a lot of consternation. I haven't read it. I don't know if its quality is anywhere near what To Kill a Mockingbird is. Ellison tried for decades to write a second novel after Invisible Man, and he just wasn't able to complete it. He left thousands of pages of manuscript when he died. One of that groupings was brushed together in 1999 in a novel called Juneteenth, and then bigger tranche of his writing was pulled together in 2010 in a third novel, if you will, called 3 Days Before the Killing, or 3 Days Before the Shooting, rather. I have it. I'm a quarter of the way through it, but I can't begin to give you an assessment of it yet. Next writer, James Baldwin, 1924 to 1987. Notes of a Native Son, interesting collection of essays written when he emigrated to Paris. He couldn't tolerate what was happening in the United States. He was also gay, and in a community of people where being gay was not widely accepted. But Baldwin is known for his essays. He wrote a number of novels as well, poems, so forth. But his essays are really some of the most erudite, thoughtful, wise pieces of nonfiction you will ever pick up and read in your life about the African American experience. Toni Morrison, Say No More, 1931 to 2019. The novel of note for her is Song of Solomon, which I've mentioned before as well, and I'll just leave it at that. It was 1977 that she wrote that. Two more to go. Alice Walker, three more to go, sorry. Born 1944, she's still alive, she's 77 years old. The Color Purple in 1982, made into a Steven Spielberg movie with Whoopi Goldberg and Danny Glover and Oprah Winfrey. A remarkably good movie. The novel itself has been one of those most frequently banned books because of its subject matter. There's a lot of rape and incest in the book. It's very disturbing. It's a hard read because of that, but it's again, one of those books you pick up and you just cannot put down. I think when I first read it, I picked it up in an afternoon, had read about a quarter of it, and by the next day I was completely done reading it. I just could not stop reading. It was impossible to put down. Very powerful work, 1982, The Color Purple. The next writer, one more to go after that, August Wilson. I haven't mentioned playwriting much at all. August Wilson was a playwright, born 1945, died 2005. Most famous for a 10-play series called the Pittsburgh Cycle. And all of the plays except one in that 10-play cycle are set in a community, an African-American neighborhood in Pittsburgh called the Hill District. And the one out of the cycle that doesn't fit in there was set in Chicago. It's called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. It's recently been made into a movie. Wilson set each of the 10 plays in each of the 10 decades of the 20th century to reflect the African American community and experience during that decade. And so each play is predicated on that. The best known of the cycle, outside of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is very well known, is a play called Fences. If you ever have the chance to see it, go see it. Wilson was an amazing. He captured so much in dialogue, and of course that's what plays thrive on, is the ability to carry something in human speech that is just an amazing playwright. The American Shakespeare. Last one, and he's a young writer, he's in his 50s now, Colson Whitehead, ColsonWhitehead, born in 1969, so he's a relatively young guy like me. He's written a dozen novels or so, short stories, and so on. His most famous so far is a novel called The Underground Railroad, which sounds like a historical piece, and it is a historical novel in a sense. It's set in the pre-Civil War era with the Underground Railroad, and it's mostly about a character named Cora, and she escapes from slavery along with another African American named Caesar, and he ends up being killed, but she ends up in the Underground Railroad, which Whitehead, interestingly, doesn't depict in the way that we think of, like Harriet Tubman and John Brown, but rather a literal underground railroad, a subway, if you will, that runs throughout the South and into the North underground, stopping at various stations along the way, which is obviously not what the Underground Railroad was. But he uses this trope, this idea, and Cora's adventures and misadventures in traveling, trying to get to freedom, being caught by this just an absolutely atrocious slave-catching character, returned or on her way to being returned. It's just an amazing adventure story. It's sort of Huckleberry Finn in reverse in some ways. It has elements of Moby Dick. It's just a remarkable tour de force of a novel. 2016. I'm not sure if I mentioned when it was published, but it's an amazing read. If you're going to be around next fall, and if you want to take an online course with me called Fantastic Literature, it's going to be in that listing of pieces of fantastic literature. So again, I'm going to post these in a document on Blackboard along with several other writers of note. But that's it. See you soon.